Good afternoon, and really excited to have a little bit of a chance to give you guys an update on government affairs. Always something happening in DC, so we've got an amazing team here to share the latest and greatest with you. I do also want to let everyone know that we will finish this session just a little bit early because Marianne is going to come back up to the podium and share the results of the survey. So I know folks will want to sneak out and start that happy hour early, but please stay so that you can find out what this room thinks the interoperability priorities will be in the coming year. With that, let me introduce our amazing panelists today. We have a new divided Congress in January. We have an administration, as you heard from Dr. Green, that's still very much implementing the Cures Act, thinking about standards, interoperability, TEFCA, information blocking, patient access. They're in our space, which is great. But we also have other high priority issues, right, that need to be worked out. Privacy, patient identity, equity, all of these very important issues. So to talk through what we might see over the next year, we have Lindsay Austin. Lindsay is the first Lindsay here, principal in the Washington, D.C. Office of Troutman Pepper Strategies. Since 2010, Lindsay's been a government relations representative for corporations, industry associations, nonprofits, and universities. She works across sectors, but with an emphasis on healthcare, health IT, public health, education, other policy areas. She did begin her career on Capitol Hill, and she was a legislative aide for Representative Lynn Westmoreland, and is a proud graduate of the University of Georgia, go Dogs, and she's currently enjoying living in the heart of Capitol Hill. So she doesn't get enough of it during the day. She goes home to Capitol Hill at night as well. And then we have Zoe, who you have obviously heard from today, but I just want to tell you a little bit about Zoe's background because she's very modest, but she has been working so hard to advance health IT adoption, health information exchange, and interoperability. Most recently, of course, here at the Sequoia Project as the policy director, and she jumped in with 2 feet to really lead policy development and strategy on TEFCA and information blocking and all of the other legislative and regulatory activities. So she takes it all on willingly and with a smile and is really a key resource for the Sequoia Project. So before coming to the Sequoia Project, she served as senior manager of federal policy at the New York eHealth Collaborative, or NICE, and also previously worked as a senior policy advisor at ONC, really moving forward National Health Information Network activities. And the other Lindsay, Lindsay Elkin, Lindsay with an E, as we say, is Chief Legal Counsel for the Sequoia Project and is a healthcare regulatory attorney with a focus on health IT. She too has jumped in with both feet, especially on TEFCA, and previously advised healthcare providers and nonprofits on issues pertaining to policy and compliance with healthcare fraud and abuse, telehealth, interoperability, information blocking, all of these good things that we care about. And she comes to the Sequoia Project from DaVita, where she was Assistant General Counsel supporting its kidney care and integrated care businesses. So I'm going to hand things over to Lindsay Austin now, who will provide a political report, including breaking news from just last night. Get away, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Chantal. Appreciate it. Chantal's been awesome, a great partner in the government relations space, so appreciate the introductions. Good to see everyone, and wouldn't drag you to Washington without at least giving you an update from Capitol Hill and all that's going on. Beyond that, you've all suffered through the ads and the text messages and the phone calls in this latest election. It seemed inundating, and I don't know about you, but I'm relieved for it to be done. It's never done, though, because election year starts right over all over again. To give you a recap, though, breaking records this year for this election, even though it was a midterm, a lot of early voting, record-breaking across the country, especially in this November 6th election in my home state of Georgia, which has been very active for the last 2 elections. Campaign spending was out the roof. I mean, the $17 billion spent across the country. This includes dollars spent at the state and local levels, too. And you guys felt the pain on your home televisions as well. But the outcome ended up being divided government, as Chantal said, but close margins. I think there was these early predictions that it might be, really close, but then Republicans felt like, oh, we're going to have a wave election in the House especially, maybe take over the Senate. And it really ended up being original, prognosticators at that, a very close election outcome, with the House getting a GOP majority, which is traditionally what happens with the opposite party in power from the White House. And so Republicans, as it stands, 222 will be in the 118th Congress, and 212 for Democrats currently. But we had a member of Congress, a great member from Virginia, pass away. And so they'll be holding a special election for Don McEachin in February 21st, and that will likely be a Democratic seat. So you'll have that 435 that you need to get for the House. Democrats have held the majority since January of 2019. Republicans gained at least 8 seats compared to the 117th Congress. So again, they eked it out. And there was questions at one point, could the Republicans actually pull off the House? There's still some questions about how they'll pull it off next year. Couple fun facts just proving that: 23 split districts in the 118th Congress, meaning 18 Republicans are from districts that Biden won in 2020, while 5 Democrats are in districts that Trump won. So the House is really dynamic. It always is. And having worked in the House, it's always a wild process. That hasn't changed. So I guess you have to appreciate it for what it is. Going over to the upper chamber, the Senate ended up also, pretty unique in terms of where we are now with this one independent that was recently announced. So it's 50 Democrats. Democrats were able to pull off the majority in tiebreaker with Raphael Warnock's race in Georgia. It was, I would say exciting, but it's exhausting at this point. But Raphael Warnock made 51 technically at the time, 49 Republicans. And then last week, Kyrsten Sinema, senator from Arizona, announced that she would become an independent. This is something that I don't think it was thought up overnight by the senator. She had these discussions, but told her leadership that she would wait until after the election to find out the outcome. I guess, at this point, we're still figuring out what that actually means. We can talk a little bit more about that. So in essence, the Democrats, they gained 1 seat in Pennsylvania, which was a Republican-held seat previously by Pat Toomey. They defended their competitive seats in Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. And Democrats have held the majority since January of 21. So it was all Democrats in the majority, House, Senate, and in the White House, and that's usually when a lot of legislation is made. So the 117th Congress was pretty productive for Democrats, but now you're pivoting to a new divided government where you're going to have to see the House and the Senate work together to get anything across the finish line. What does a 51-49 versus 50-50 mean in the Senate? This is about the committee balance, which is now up in the air, considering Kyrsten Sinema has told Leader Schumer that she would not caucus with the Democrats, but that she would consider, she would want the leader to position her on her committee. So that gives him sort of the reign in that choice. But we're still not certain if that will allow for the balance. So the balance right now is 50-50. So that means they share resources and staff and dollars. And, ultimately the chair is still in the Democratic control. But it does make it a little more complicated as far as like how many staffers the Republican ranking members can hire on certain committees. So the other thing is, what I think is really important to people like Chuck Schumer is getting their nominees across the finish line. That's been a big holdup. It was a holdup, it was challenging for McConnell and it's challenging for Schumer, but now that they can assure some of those votes and not have to have a tiebreaker for a lot of votes with the vice president, I think there's a little bit more comfort there. And then the general management of the Senate. So I hope that is intriguing and helpful. Some people want to know. Me personally, I've been in Washington, D.C. 18 years this this month. And I feel like every iteration of Washington as far as who's in charge of what, White House, House, Senate, but never these close of margins. This is really unique in how close it is, but it tells you something about what the electorate wanted. So let's jump into what does this even look like as far as leadership goes. We have a lot of shakeup, I guess, with the House flipping over to Republicans. The Senate will look pretty similar to what it did in the current Congress. We have anticipated that Kevin McCarthy will become the next Speaker of the House, but we still have some challenges on January 3rd where he has the right wing of his caucus has claimed that they will not vote for him, and he has to get that majority number of votes to become Speaker. We understand that that could be a couple of rounds of voting to have that happen. This is all sort of, nuanced, and it will be more clear come the start of the 118th Congress when they set the rules. But McCarthy has an uphill battle, and it won't just be January 3rd. It'll be throughout the 118th Congress because he has this group of, a collective that by all means, they were elected to Congress, and they need to share their voice, and they know that they have a lot of folks in that Freedom Caucus wing of the party, and so they're going to hold his feet to the fire. So not an easy job there. And then, of course, on the Democratic side, we had an unprecedented event with all of the longstanding leadership of the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, offering to step down out of their senior leadership roles to make room for the new class, including Hakeem Jeffries coming in as the minority leader. Very dynamic, new member, new face to see, really refreshing, and I think Democrats are motivated, so we'll have to watch and see how they do from a bipartisan standpoint. Committees on the House side, will point out that, of course, now the chairman for each of these committees are going to be Republicans, so you're going to see relevant committees to this group. I would say I selected, there's going to be a lot of changeover, but the ones I wanted to point out were Energy and Commerce being led by Kathy McMorris Rogers, who currently serves as the ranking member. Frank Pallone got elected yesterday by his caucus as the ranking member for the Democrats, served on that committee for a really long time. Ways and Means, still up in the air. That committee has jurisdiction over revenue measures and taxes and Medicaid and Medicare, and does share jurisdiction with Energy and Commerce on a lot of policy. Richie Neal is expected to stay in that ranking member position. We will know who will get that Ways and Means slot likely in January. And House Appropriations was just a straight flip with Rosa DeLauro and Kay Granger. Important because we'll get to that. The Appropriations Committee funds all the federal agencies. So to make sure that all those wonderful programs that you benefit from and you expect to see each year, appropriators make those decisions. On the Senate side, we have, I'll skip over the leadership, that pretty much stands, but the Help Committee, I think this one is really unique. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but Bernie Sanders is going to be the chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. This is huge. This was, kind of upends a lot of what folks have been used to, with Patty Murray having led the committee, from the Democrat side, and Richard Burr retiring. And of course, Bill Cassidy, physician from Louisiana, as the ranking member of Help Committee, will be a really interesting dynamic with the two of them. We're eager to work with them and have worked with both of their offices, but I think knowing what kind of members these are, I think keep an eye on this committee as being really active. Senate Finance, again, is staying put with Wyden and with Crapo, and then Patty Murray, that's where we left open the seat for Help Committee because she chose to take the appropriations position after Leahy retired. So great members to watch and keep an eye on when it comes to health policy in the next Congress and what they've carried forward in the current Congress. It's not going to be too different from that. All right, well, we're in the lame duck agenda right now. We're in the heat of it. And so Chantal mentioned some late breaking. Last night, they announced that the appropriators had a deal made for FY23. We were facing a continuing resolution, shut down potentially on the 16th, but they're going to vote tonight. The House is going to vote tonight on the legislation to continue the federal budget until December 23rd. And between then, they're going to negotiate the final details of that. But while we were starting to believe there might be some kind of shutdown or continuing resolution into 2023 when Republicans take over the House, it's looking more and more like there's going to be an omnibus agreement. What that means to you is those agencies are going to be funded at the levels that were recommended by the committees as they rolled out their legislation throughout this past year for FY23. Means they can get to business on FY24 next year. I mentioned a few other pieces here. We don't have to go in too deep detail, but the Prevent Pandemics Act was knowing we just came off of this public health panel, that was a big priority for Murray and Burr. They're going to try and attach that onto the legislation if they can. This is all being negotiated in a week, and everybody wants to go home for Christmas. So I think everybody's hoping to get their little piece in, but it really does come down, push comes to shove, that there's only a few things that will be considered riders on the annual omnibus expected on the 23rd. The National Defense Authorization Act passed every year for 62 years. Have a feeling this one's going to be fine. Some other supplemental, the emergency supplemental, Ukraine money, that's discussed. I think Ukraine money is pretty much baked. It will be attached to the bill. And then, of course, the White House wants more COVID dollars. This has just been the continued drumbeat. Republicans don't want that. They will not hold up an omnibus to get more COVID dollars. However, I think they'll continue to ask for it. So you can see this little duck is still floating. It's not completely sunk. Some of the other programs I think would be interesting to you guys is some of these expiring programs that would have expired on December 16th. They're attaching on to this week-long continuing resolution to the 23rd. So they'll be extended through the end of the year, but have to be considered for the omnibus. So I won't read them all out, but you get the idea. There's some of these programs that really do depend on the continued reauthorization of the programs, as their deadlines approach each Congress or each year. And then, from the physician clinical side of things, the reimbursement cuts are definitely a hot issue right now. Right now, we're even under a 2% sequestration that's in effect, and then January 1st, we're facing a lot of these other cuts that are listed here, where I know the medical community is out there lobbying to make sure that these programs get considered. So keeping an eye on all of these, but at the same time, usually Congress is used to working this way. I know that stresses me out just thinking about it, but I deal with it every year. And I think that they're prepared to be able to make sure they take care of some of these items, because they know how important it is, not only just to get it done, but for their constituents. Okay, and I think we're good on time, but I'll keep moving along. Okay, so looking forward, what is the Republican House going to do about healthcare policy? It's not a secret. They're not holding back until January 3rd to tell you this. They've been very clear about what they want to achieve if they were to, sweep the House of Representatives or even win the House of Representatives. They put together these Healthy Futures Task Force partners and policies where they, assembled their different groups to talk about these issues and laid out, white papers. And so they're being very serious about addressing issues like modernizing healthcare, treatment solutions, security, pandemic preparedness response, and the list goes on. But Republicans are definitely focused on addressing some of the issues. I have Kathy McMorris Rogers here. If you don't recognize her, she will be your chairwoman of Energy and Commerce. And then I put Brett Guthrie on there because he'll be your healthcare subcommittee chairman, and he's already been there as ranking member. So you'll see a lot of him as far as managing some of the policy. But going back to the priorities for Republicans, I did pick out the House because I think it's sort of, we'll get over to the Senate side. It's a little different in the upper chamber, but it's going to be pretty raucous. There's going to be a lot of oversight discussions. I don't think that comes as any surprise. They've said they really want to talk about the origins of COVID. They've sent letters to the administration about this, to the CDC. They want to know how these COVID dollars were spent. So you're going to see a lot of noise and a lot of hearings. And I don't mean to say noise. It's very important, and I know it's important to the members that are putting it together and assembling these policies and these hearings, but oversight is going to be the word of the year. Get ready. Brace yourselves. Opioid epidemic. I think this one, even though it's in the health policy list, it's not in the bipartisan list. I do think there's a bipartisan opportunity with the opioid crisis. This was something that we were trying to address and pass legislation before the pandemic occurred. So, keep an eye out for that. And then the debt ceiling. This one is always tricky because it gets really dramatized, and it really can be very serious. I mean, we could run into a lot of serious issues, but they're going to use it as a political tool in order to get what they need out of the Senate Democrats and potentially the president in order to get the debt limit handled over the course of the end of Q1 up to Q3, I think, next year. I don't have to tell you about it. You'll hear about it in the news. They'll make it very dramatic, so just get ready for that. All right, so let's look at some of the bipartisan opportunities. Some of these pieces of legislation will be familiar to you and the organizations you represent and work for. The American Data Privacy and Protection Act is extremely popular, and it's also been a really hot topic, and I don't want want to say, share too much because I think we're going to talk a little bit about that with the panel. But this legislation was passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's kind of held up right now in the Senate because I know Maria Cantwell, the chairwoman of the Commerce Committee, has had some concerns. But we could see some dynamics shifting with the ADPPA, with Kevin McCarthy potentially coming on as speaker. He won't have quite the influence or the interest that Speaker Pelosi did in sort of moderating this conversation. But obviously this topic is really important to everybody, to consumers, to, because this bill covers not only healthcare, but it covers a lot of other industry areas. So, keep an eye out for that. And honestly, the advocacy around it, I think they really want to move it without changing it too much. And then Healthcare Cybersecurity Act, another sort of sub-issue of that, but something to keep an eye on. Telehealth. It's so funny because we've talked about telehealth for so long in the policy arena, but it's all of a sudden got its due under a crisis, and then finally realized, okay, telehealth is important. What does telehealth mean? Telemedicine. Now we're all learning because of COVID what that actually means, and so I think that has really awakened a beast as far as people really supporting it and members of Congress coming together in a bipartisan fashion to pass legislation. The House passed the bill. There's obviously, the pandemic, the public health emergency does expire. We have to take that into consideration because it allowed for, telehealth to be covered by Medicare, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But I think telehealth will continue to stay on the tips of the tongues of most providers and the customer and patient community. I think it's a great topic to be a part of, and I think Sequoia Project at some point will weigh in on this. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later with the panel. And then a couple of other areas of interest, keep your eye on ARPA-H. That was a really big deal. They were able to fund that at $1 billion. They still have to authorize the bill, figure out where it's going to be physically, figure out where it's going to be in the agency. I think there's some negotiation, and different bills have it housed out of NIH, and then some have it as its own agency within HHS. All of that has to be worked out. And then, of course, there's 10 cities vying to have ARPA-H in their hometown. I think there's this idea that it's going to be this windfall of funding right into the building, but it really is just going to be experts working out of this, this single location. My hometown, or not hometown, but home state, Georgia's definitely one of those because it has CDC in its backyard. But there's going to be some negotiations around that, and the decision will be made by HHS. So mental health packages, another big topic for possible bipartisanship. And there's a handful of policy reports that have been released by the Finance Committee. Really keep an eye out for that. That seems to be something that members of Congress can coalesce around. And I put drug pricing, lower healthcare costs, surprise billing all lumped together because I actually think this is something that Senators Sanders and Cassidy are going to emphasize while they're working the HELP committee. And Energy and Commerce looks at these issues too from a bipartisan standpoint. Couldn't have a Sequoia conversation without bringing up CARES, although this CARES really doesn't have much to do with what we're working on by design. I think that the committee wanted to allow for a continued rollout of CARES 1.0, but CARES 2.0 technically did stall in the Energy and Commerce Committee because of some poison pill amendments, but it could be an opportunity to refresh that legislation next Congress, and it might include more health IT related provisions addressing the pandemic. It could be another vehicle for if the Prevent Pandemics Act does not get passed, it might be an opportunity for negotiation there. But Fred Upton is retiring this year, and he was definitely a lead voice, but I still think there's some other members that'll be hungry to work on those policies. So making my way through this. Okay, everybody, bear with me. I know it's cocktail time. HHS priorities, you can't talk about what's going on in Washington without addressing some of the areas of interest for the administration. We didn't want to emphasize it too much because I think it's all pretty consistent, knowing that this is the midterms and they're going to stay pretty charged ahead on their areas of interest. So long COVID, I know that that's becoming, with all of the outbreaks that are occurring this time of year and the challenges that they're facing with getting people vaccinated and boosted. Long COVID is definitely going to stay in the front. It's going to stay in the spotlight for this administration. CMS payment reform, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. So those Medicare drug price negotiation provisions that were included are definitely going to be a priority for this administration and Secretary Becerra. ARPA-H, as I mentioned, I think that's critical. They really want to show So knowing that Biden he was a cancer moonshot guy, so I think this is sort of an offshoot and continuation of the work that he did as vice president in the previous term. Health equity and social determinants of health, I think that continues to be a drumbeat for this administration. And for a lot of you in your organizations, I know it's a priority from the ground up. And so I think that will be a continued priority for the administration. Public health modernization, CDC, is going to continue its work on data modernization, which they were doing even before the pandemic. But they did launch their centers for forecasting and outbreak analytics. I think that's going to be there for kind of the updated version of what they currently had, and just showing more focus on getting ready for pandemics. CDC Data Authority, we can talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's going to continue to be a challenge where we want, they're stuck in this double-edged sword, the CDC. We expect them to do all they need to do to prevent pandemics, to provide public health resources, but then they need data authority. They need that extra support, and they have to have it authorized to them through Congress. So, just kind of watch out. CDC is going to be in the spotlight too in that regard. So those aren't the limit of what the administration's working on in 2023. We're going to have things pop up, but I would say this is what we've sort of assessed from our work that we've done and seeing what Congress wants to do. And don't forget, they have to do it together. So Congress can be like, hey, White House, HHS, especially when the House is in charge and they're doing the big O oversight, we got to make sure that you're doing it right, and they'll call them to task and make them come before Congress and testify on all these policies. So, I'm glad to be able to give you guys a rundown. I hope it's helpful, and I think this is a good transition to allow Zoe to talk a little bit more about the regulatory side, which can get super complex, and we're so lucky to have good experts, Chantal as well. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I only have one slide, but with a lot of great content on it, although it's very hard to see from up here.
You got it all memorized.
I should have memorized my slide. Let's see how I do. Hi again, everybody. Glad to make it to the end of the day today. And so on this slide, I tried to really focus in on the federal regulatory priorities focused on interoperability, and where the Sequoia project is really focusing our time and energy. As you saw from Lindsay's presentation, there are endless priorities in this administration, but these are the ones where I really have focused my time and attention to. So in 2022, a lot happened in 2022. First of all, CMS made a big splash with their payment rules, as they do every year. But this year, they finalized their proposal that for FY 2023, and this specifically related to the Medicare Promoting Interoperability Programs, formerly Meaningful Use. But they finalized a new optional alternative measure under the Health Information Exchange objective that allows eligible hospitals and clinicians to claim credit for the objective by participating in the Trust Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. And last year, they finalized a proposal for 2022 to allow clinicians and hospitals to claim credit for that measure by participating in a health information exchange, and bidirectional exchange with a health information exchange. So they just took that one step further this year by specifically naming the TEFCA, which I think gives us a little bit of insight into how CMS is trying to align their priorities with ONC. Next, of course, we had several new milestones related to information sharing or information blocking. We were all waiting on the edge of our seats all year for the final OIG enforcement rule for health IT developers and health information networks, and alas, it never came. But there's still, right, exactly. There's still time, but we saw a lot of other progress being made this year. Of course, October 6th came and went, otherwise known as Data Liberation Day. That's the new federal holiday, at least in the health IT world. But as you could see from our shirts and from the presentations earlier, the industry did a lot of work. Sequoia did a lot of work to prepare us for that day and for the requirements requirement to exchange all electronic health information under the information blocking rules. And so as far as I know, October 6th came and went, nothing broke, everything is still standing, and so I guess we'll see what's yet to come in terms of implementing the full EHI provisions. Also, the President's FY23 proposed budget had some interesting language that, if passed, would give ONC the authority to provide binding advisory opinions for information blocking. So stakeholders would actually be able to submit certain scenarios or situations to ONC, and they would provide a binding opinion such that that opinion could be relied upon, in the event of an information blocking complaint, the opinion can be relied upon to avoid penalties as long as, they stuck to the same facts that were submitted to HHS for that situation. Also, ONC did a fantastic job, and they really, emphasized promoting and releasing new educational resources, FAQs, blogs, webinars, diagrams, all sorts of things, and if you haven't yet, you should go check out their website because it really is a great resource. But they really made an effort this year to try to provide clarity to the industry around some of the areas where there is ambiguity, and there are a lot of areas of ambiguity around the information blocking regulation. And so they continue to put an emphasis on that, and we really appreciate that. Sequoia really appreciates that too, as we've submitted several FAQs for their consideration. Next, cure certification requirements. So, also, this year we saw, and we will see at the end of the month, several of the 2015 Cures Update certification requirements go into effect. Health IT developers will now have to provide customers with a standardized API for individual and population health services. And there are several other criterion and communications, attestations, real-world testing requirements that all went into effect this year. Also, ONC published USCDI version 3, which added some new, very important data elements around social determinants of health, health insurance information, health status and assessments, as well as an expanded set of patient demographics. And so while we may not see this be an actual requirement anytime soon, again, it really signals to the industry, where we're going and what are the really, critical pieces of data that we should be capturing and exchanging in order to support whole patient care. Okay, next we saw a couple of weeks ago, actually, we've talked about this a little today already, but that Office for Civil Rights and SAMHSA released their long-awaited Part 2 proposed rule, comments due, I think, the end of January. This, as you all know, 42 CFR Part 2 is the federal regulation governing the confidentiality of substance use information, and the proposed changes implement provisions of the CARES Act, and are really intended to align some of the stringent confidentiality requirements in 42 CFR Part 2 with the HIPAA rules. So one of the key takeaways that I took from reading the proposed rule is that they are proposing now that there would be a single consent that would govern the access, use, disclosure, redisclosure, particularly the redisclosure of substance use information for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. CMS interoperability and electronic prior authorization proposed rule. You heard a little bit about this. If you were here yesterday, Alex Muggy talked about it a little bit, and then we had Dr. Mary Green today. This is, of course, something that the Sequoia project is very focused on. We're planning on submitting comments, and this provides requirements for health plans to make data accessible via FHIR APIs, as well as to respond to requests for prior authorizations via FHIR APIs. TEFCA implementation, talked a lot about that yesterday and today, made a lot of progress this year with TEFCA implementation. And then we're just continuing to see an emphasis, as Lindsay said, in the administration on health equity, social determinants of health, and public health. I mean, we're even still seeing in some of these rules, these proposed rules, requests for information surrounding sharing of social determinant of health data and behavioral health data. So looking forward to 2023, hopefully we'll see final CMS and OCR SAMHSA rules. We're still waiting for those information sharing enforcement rules, so 2023 is the year. We're looking forward to both provider disincentives as well as the final OIG rule for health IT developers and health information networks. And then also there is an ONC proposed rule that's in OMB clearance. Somebody tell me if it's come out of OMB clearance, because I haven't had a chance to check this week.
Not as of this morning.
Well, and they are trying very hard to get away from that reputation. So, so hopefully that one will come in the new year. But that is also intended to provide more clarifications and enhancements around the information sharing rules, as well as updates to the certification criteria. USCDI version 4.
Color it out and tell you what it is.
Continuing to expand, the interoperability, the data elements needed for interoperability. And then, of course, TEFCA, initial onboarding and designation. I said before, 2023 is the year we set TEFCA on fire. Maybe even start to think about bulk data exchange to really support public health use cases. And then finally, the HIPAA final rule, which they've been very quiet for the past year. We saw the proposed rule in 2021 that proposed modifications to support care coordination, improve patient right of access, and to provide other clarifications and updates. So again, 2023 is the year, and we're looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Zoe. And I will just observe that probably this time last year, the 2022 list would have been shorter than the 2021 list, because things happen over the course of the year to make the list longer and longer. So much activity in interoperability, which I think is really exciting, right? It's somewhat exhausting, but it's also really exciting. So we're going to move on and just have a couple of discussion questions among the group here, and then we have a special question for all of you after that. But for Lindsay Elkind, so during the pandemic, Medicare really did provide flexibility, right, for the provision of telehealth services, and it meant we could take off in terms of, under Medicare in particular, providing telehealth services without geographic restrictions and allowing telehealth to the home. But that was really tied to the public health emergency. And increasingly, we're starting to get some signals that the public health emergency will end. So what are the expectations for telehealth moving forward, and how's that going to work out?
Yeah, I mean, first just thinking about telehealth generally, I mean, you can insert your favorite idiom in there, but cat out of the bag, toothpaste out of the tube, etc. It's here. I think it's here to stay.
Waking the beast is what I said.
Waking the beast.
Yeah.
That's another good one. We could go all day. But I think with the public health emergency and the increase in use of telehealth over the pandemic, it's become clear the usability of telehealth and its potential really for effectiveness in providing care and lifting barriers and creating access. At the same time, it's very undeveloped, and it's new, and it's emerging, and it also has the hope of helping us with some of those barriers moving forward. It's also ripe, I think, as we know, for the potential for fraud, waste, and abuse as well. So keeping an eye on that, and maybe some unintended consequences that could potentially come with telehealth in terms of care coordination. In fact, a few folks were just talking about this the other day, and making sure that we're not frustrating attempts at care coordination and creating increased fragmentation with telehealth. So to answer your question, there has been some legislation. Yes, the public health emergency, I think, was renewed through the middle of next month, but to be seen how that will get renewed and how long that will go on. There was some legislation, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, that is going to extend a lot of the telehealth flexibilities that we've seen related to geographic restrictions, ability for patients to receive care as the originating site in their home, just the list of providers that are able to provide telehealth services for 151 days. Don't ask me where they got that time frame. Maybe there's a reason around that. But 151 days beyond when the public health emergency expires. So a lot of these flexibilities will be extended, and I think the intent there is really to give folks time to continue to dig into things like quality and some of those unintended consequences I mentioned. CMS also released their 2023 physician fee schedule, which also touches on that 151 days, also extending other certain things through the end of 2023, so around some certain aspects of payment parity and other things. Really, their intent there is the same thing. You know, typically they had 2 buckets of telehealth codes. They created a third for the pandemic, and essentially it's trying to think through which one of these codes should be permanent. So I touched on earlier, just thinking about how things could potentially be ripe for fraud, waste, and abuse. The OIG has really focused on that, and other agencies, you know, thinking from a telefraud perspective and enforcement perspective, there has been a lot of activity there. But also just OIG's focus and their work plans and their reporting. In fact, I think they created a website where they've consolidated a lot of the enforcement efforts and a lot of the information with respect to telehealth all on one site. But they have focused on it with respect to the impact of the public health emergency. And they did have a recent report that sort of highlighted certain aspects of what could be considered a high-risk provider and some details and some recommendations for CMS around sort of creating a more specific framework, education, things of that nature to help identify and hopefully lessen that potential and create some guardrails around it. So yeah, I guess like a few key takeaways and sort of tying telehealth back to interoperability. We think about just all the things that are going on in the telehealth space. You know, you have new entrants, you have new mobile applications, you have new codes for remote patient monitoring from CMS. And it's important, I think, and again, I heard folks talking about this the other day, to think about the disparate systems and apps and really focus on interoperability for telehealth as well. Where does that information go? Is it making its way back to electronic health record? I was just talking with Alan earlier too about how do we think about this in the context of purposes of use under interoperability frameworks like for treatment. How do we document these things? So I think it's going to continue to be an important thing to focus on for interoperability as well.
Awesome. I would just say, add to that, this is a great bridge. It's tangible. Telehealth is tangible. Voters, constituents. This is where you're going to get members of Congress reacting. We talked a little bit about it, you know, as far as they are reacting. They're supportive. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is that bridge to really have the consumer and the patient understand the importance of interoperability and defining that in terms of what they experienced during the pandemic firsthand. I had not done telehealth, you know, visits with my doctors until COVID, and so now I can say I get it. And I don't know if necessarily portals will be involved, but it's, you know, definitionally telehealth could really be the bridge to make people see interoperability in a tangible light.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know we're coming up on our time, but I did want to raise another one of those really big issues. So, you know, Lindsay, the challenge to you, so quickly, one of the main challenges with information sharing is navigating, right? All these multiple privacy rules. So you've got the HIPAA baseline, but that only applies to certain covered entities. So what are these key issues in privacy that you're seeing?
Well, that is a big question, so I'll
Yeah.
try to think about it in pieces, and I know we are between people and their cocktails, so try to make that quick. I guess a few top issues that come to mind is state law. I think a lot of the complexity that can come out of the various states that are implementing their own privacy frameworks. So California, of course, will come to mind, but also Colorado and Connecticut and more recently Virginia. So I think continuing to see where states go and focusing on that complexity will continue to be a top issue. I think OCR's continued focus on the individual right of access, paying attention to that and where enforcement goes with that. Also artificial intelligence, AI. So if we're thinking about just as AI and machine learning become more pervasive and frankly more powerful, thinking about issues potentially with misuse or disclosure of data in terms of collecting it for use in algorithms and also security aspects of that. So I think those are just a few things that come to mind when I'm thinking about what top issues are. Also personally, I'm also always taking a peek at what the plaintiffs' bar is doing with respect to private right of action and privacy and where that goes. So I'll continue to try to keep a pulse on that as well.
Yeah, and I think that becomes a crossover, right, to a little bit of what's happening on Capitol Hill. Are we going to get to a place where we have some sort of federal privacy law or not? And how will that treat healthcare or not? And what will the state preemption look like or not, right? So I think that's a really big issue to watch for in 2023. But speaking of issues to watch for in 2023, I had a wrap-up question for the panel that we decided to throw to you guys. So that wrap-up question is, what's on your list of topics to watch for in 2023? How can the Sequoia project be helpful in monitoring for the issues that really matter to you? So we'll give you all a minute or two to think about that. And feel free to raise your hand and get a mic.
Hi, I'm Stephen Murphy with the Network for Public Health Law. What really piqued my interest was the CDC Data Authority. And I think COVID has really illustrated the lack of a national public health data infrastructure in this country, and as evidenced by the fact that we had to look at data from the UK and Israel around trends. But I'm wondering if you guys could give any more insight as to whether you think that has legs or not, whether we will see CDC Data Authority in 2023.
I'll take that one. There is legislation that's been offered by Congressman Underwood and Senator Kaine that would address this issue. Right now, it's kind of a political hot potato. Obviously, Republicans are a little concerned with what CDC would do with that new authority. CDC needs to do a really good job explaining the complexities of what they're going through, because they were blamed a lot for not being able to collect the data quickly enough, knowing that it was inaccurate. It was about the content of the data, how good it was, and CDC really needed to do it quickly. There were other entities getting involved. And they said, well, really, we don't have the authority. So a couple of folks on Capitol Hill really understood that and said, we're going to try and look at it through, a standalone legislation. Tim Kaine did try to get that attached to the Prevent Pandemics Act. Instead, they took a different approach that does not provide for authority, but it does provide for new programs that would help the CDC better manage data, maximizing what they're already doing with DMI data modernization. So, I think it's going to be addressed. I think there's going to be a lot of advocacy around it. And so, CDC Walensky actually going out recently, 2 different interviews, putting this as her #1 priority, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director. So I think there's real hope for it, but it has to be messaged in a way that makes it non-political and reminding people this is de-identified data. And it actually protects the public's data better if the CDC can have that control over it. I'm offering my opinion about it, although there could be some disagreement throughout the debate, but I think the debate is healthy, and it's time for CDC to really be able to shine and show what they can do and what they should do. And Malinsky would not deny the fact that she needs everyone's engagement. She has said, I want all the other agencies to be involved with this. This is not just owned by the CDC. ASPR, CMS, HHS, the White House, Congress. I think she's really open to that, so hopeful.
Fantastic. We have another question over here. Hard to see. Hey, Jim. Go ahead.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, hey, I know a lot of us are thinking about FHIR, the new APIs, and third-party apps that may arise out of that provide enormous benefit, obviously, to patients. But one of the concerns that we all have, we've done a lot of work here, we don't want to see things get knocked back to the Stone Age. And sometimes when bad things happen with the data or bad apps that hurt people, sometimes that can lead to heartstrings regulation that sends us back, right? I think a little bit about the National Patient Identifier, right? You know, and so I know we've talked about the FTC and maybe the industry itself trying to protect and rate apps, but since we're talking about the legislative branch as well, is HR 8152, is there any effort on the legislative side to try to address third-party app behavior that might undermine what we're all trying to do if bad things occur? Because I know in the last administration and talking to Don Rucker and others, it was sort of, well, that's the patient responsibility, right? But I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I was just curious about your insights into whether there's any momentum to try to address poorly designed, unsafe apps or people, apps that actually don't handle the data appropriately.
On the specifics of the bill, I'd have to look. I think everything starts back over fresh, 118th Congress, but on the topic itself, you see senators walking around with their Apple Watches, their Oura Rings, their cell phones. They know this is a very clear area of interest to them. They have to wonder, I'm a senator. Is my data protected? Like, how does this work? So I don't think it's lost upon them that these issues need to be addressed, but I do think it has to do with like overburdensome regulation and what they're going to be looking at and debating from the Republican side. This jurisdiction will fall in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the bill sponsor, but I think it's worth following and tracking. It'll be a new bill number if it's reintroduced. I do think it's going to build a lot of attention because of the topics around the ADPPA, the privacy legislation, fits right into that category pretty clearly. So I would say that yes, it's also potentially a place to find some bipartisan crossover where there's that, again, tangible understanding of how these applications work. And if people hear, well, you know, that actually isn't covered, like the government doesn't know how that works. And I think that that can be alarming to some members of Congress who may not pay attention to it until it buzzes and say, you need to walk 10,000 steps today. And they're like, how does it know that? Who's looking after that? So I hope that that helps. It's not specific on the legislation, but I think it's probable to get reintroduced.
And I would also add, you know, you mentioned the FTC, and the FTC is kind of stepping up its game, right, in these areas, and has made some announcements, right, and held a few health app companies to account for not being consistent with their own privacy policies, which is pretty much the FTC's authority at this point in time. So I think we will see continued attention to the issue, and it will, you know, definitely be a topic of conversation in the next Congress, no question.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, also as you know, Chantal said, within the confines of their authority, I mean, you're seeing agencies putting a lot of emphasis on, you know, continued or patient education around, you know, their role and their responsibility, ensuring their privacy when using these third-party apps. And, you know, even most recently after the Dobbs ruling, OCR issued guidance that, you know, among other things, you know, tried to help patients to understand, you know, some of the privacy implications of using those third-party apps, and, you know, provide some tips on how they can secure their information when using those tools. I think we'll continue to see that kind of education.
And we'll do one last priority there.
Yeah, that was the mic drop.
This is drop the mic. We're done.
That's the end. I dropped the mic.
Yeah, I'm David Dietrich with Velatura. Hello to Lindsay, Zoe. Follow up on Stephen's question. So CDC has gone around and, as you said, Lindsay, talked about creating a new network, right? But I'd like to get your comments about how a HDU or health data utility would fill that gap, and taxpayers have already paid for HIEs, and the health data utility is an evolution of an HIE, by the way. So the CDC doesn't have to start from scratch.
David Dietrich, I'm so glad you're here. That's a good question. Health data utility, this is definitely an evolving topic in order to really ramp up how on the ground HIEs are working with their community partners to better facilitate data exchange. We'll leave it at that for now. It's growing, and definitely definitionally we want the government to be engaged there. But I think when it comes to the CDC, it's in play. I think there's a lot of opportunity through the Data Modernization Initiative, separately from the pandemic response and their surveillance on future pandemics. But DMI is made for something like health data utility or potentially supporting the HIEs. It's a two-way street. That's really what they need. Wouldn't it be nice if the CDC could go to one entity in a state or a region and say, can we facilitate this information exchange from public health through you rather than all the disparate sources that they have to do right now? So there could be a way to create an agreement in that arena, but a lot of that has to be the decision-making of the agencies and potentially authorized by Congress. So absolutely, communicating with the CDC about how to best utilize that on-the-ground data is going to be key.
Yeah, and we continue to provide comments, and I know that the health information exchanges are doing the same, urging the CDC to leverage their existing resources and the existing infrastructure of health information networks across the country.
Well, thank you so much for sticking with us. Please join me in thanking our panel.